Heavenly Father,
Heavenly Father,
Divine Mother,
Divine
Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your divine vision. Help us to know what your will is for us. Inspire us with the desire to serve and guide us with the wisdom to know how to do it. We long to live in the light of your presence. Take us by the hand, show us the way. Om, peace. Amen. It's a really, this is a really challenging topic in so many ways, and I really am not 100% sure. So I'm just going to kind of shoot out in all directions, and then we'll stop and ask questions. Jyotish and Devi, of course, will have a lot to say next week. In a strange sort of way, they were much more involved in founding, even though I'm a founding member of Ananda Village, and I definitely am. At one point, we gave ourselves numbers, and I think I'm number 13, if I'm not mistaken, of the people who came and stayed. I was actually slightly late because I didn't get there till 71, but of the people who stayed, I ended up being number 13. I think I was 12, but Haridas was named after me, and that was a mistake because he preceded me. So I never got my number. So I have the wrong number by one. Anyway, so I really was there, and I really was there at the beginning. But Jyotish and Devi really helped make the community happen. I never lived at the community proper, what people call the village. I was at the retreat, and I was at Ayodhya, and I never actually ever lived on that village property. And Jyotish and Devi almost always lived there. And of course, Jyotish was the manager and Swami's representative in everything, and he was masterful at everything he did. So to a certain extent, what happened in Palo Alto is a lot more the story of what you guys are working with. And what happened to us here, and I'll just sort of give you a little bit about it so you can think about it. At the time that Swami asked me to move to Palo Alto, he also asked Ananta and Maria to move to Sacramento. And prior to that time, and in 1979, he had Jyotish and Devi go to San Francisco and set up an ashram house in San Francisco. I trailed along on the San Francisco venture, but I was never meant to be part of it. So Swami made sure that I was not there very much and not really very involved. It's the only time I intruded myself on a project, and I never did it again. So at that time, we had a house in Sacramento. Then we had a small house in Sacramento that Haridas and Vijay were running, I believe, prior to Ananta and Maria. And we had the big ashram house in San Francisco. So in 1986 is when he asked us all to go. Ananta and Maria moved immediately to Sacramento. David and I waited until January because we had our first pilgrimage to India, so we couldn't go. Anandi and Bara were actually operating in Palo Alto. What we had at that point was a large ashram house, East-West bookshop. And we bought East-West bookshop in 81. And in order to support East-West bookshop, we set up an ashram house because everybody who was really part of Ananda did not want to live on their own. They wanted to live in some way in company with devotees. And large ashram houses were sort of the model that we had. But anybody who went to work in a city center, which was Sacramento and San Francisco, and then Palo Alto at that point, you lasted about 18 months. That was sort of like the lifespan of a center. We called them center leaders at that point, because the mindset Oh, we got Ocean Song also at 79, which was that community by the coast. That was really lovely, but in the end, we couldn't keep it. Because the man was going to donate the property to us, and in the end, he wouldn't do it. And so we had to withdraw after 7 years, just to explain that. Otherwise, it was a glorious success, but in the end, it was a fizzle. But the only word we used the word Ananda with no modifiers, because Ananda was Ananda Village, so there was no necessity to say Ananda Village. And the mindset was that Ananda was Ananda Village. And we had these centers out there, and it'd been from 1979, and by now this is 1986, not quite a decade, but a few years. And Ocean Song had come and gone. But the lifespan of a center leader was about 18 months. It was considered to be an exile. You were exiled from your home. You worked on it. You did good work. I mean, I'm making this up. You might get different answers, but this is how it appeared to me. You did good work for 12 months. For 12 months. Then you began to die on the vine and began to beg to be allowed to go home. And then at a certain point, you were rescued. So I believe Ananda and Bharat had hit about the 18-month mark. Maybe it was a little longer, but I think that's what it was. And we were sent down there to relieve them. And the idea was that we would all do it together. But they went up to take a rest at Ananda Village and never returned. But there was a very interesting discussion going on at that time, that the commitment of our energy and of Ananta and Maria's energy by Swami, because we were in the army, he just assigned us, was a very different attitude toward other places than Ananda Village, because the four of us represented, we represented a tremendous amount of magnetism, and we also represented very key people in everything that was going on. David was running the Yoga Fellowship at that time. I think he was running Crystal Clarity. He was running the guest programs. I was the primary teacher at the retreat. One of the main teachers at the retreat. I traveled for Ananda and helped bring a lot of people in to the retreat and so on. So to take us out of all of, and Ananta and Maria were running the farm and all that, to take us out of that and put us elsewhere was just a total shift. And it was actually, there was a lot of different attitudes about it. It was believed that anybody who was serious about Ananda would want to live at the village, and that nobody who was seriously committed to Ananda would ever want to live anywhere else. And so city centers were basically seen as recruitment centers, where you recruited, you found serious devotees and you recruited them to move to the village. And the prevailing philosophy was nobody of any depth or quality would ever stay with you in your center. So it was a setup to fail. Your center never really needed to be anything. It was just to find folk and send them to where they really belonged. Now, we argued against that, because if that were true, that meant that Ananda was not ever going to grow, and that Master's idea that this would spread like wildfire was pretty crazy, and that a certain capacity to leave everything behind and go live in this remote rural village before the age of the internet, bear in mind, and live at excruciatingly poor wages, was the only model that would ever work, and it didn't look practical to us. So when we went down is always how it's actually south, but I tried very hard not to use that word down. We went down to Palo Alto. I know they say that down to Los Angeles, but I don't like the vibe of that. But in any case, we had pretty much an open assignment from Swamiji when we asked him, what should we do? His answer was very vintage Kriyananda. He said, I don't know. He said, you're the ones who are going to be there. After you've been there for a while, you tell me what's possible. Because, and this is a first rule of founding community, you can't just imagine it. You have to actually, energy has its own intelligence. If you make up all your pieces of paper with all your words on them and then go down and look for how to make your words a reality. That's never been the way that Swami has created anything. You know, it grows organically from the inside out. And I will say a little bit more about this in a moment, but you don't start with the definition. And that's why Swami said, I mean, how would I know? And of course, he must have had some idea, but how would I know was really the right answer? Because you're going to be there and you're going to be part of it. So, but he basically said, you know, you've been here at Ananda Village. By that time I'd been there since 16 years. And he said, see how much of this you can replicate. So it was pretty much an open door. Just, you know what Ananda looks like. Can you do it again? Try to do it again. So we decided to try to do it again. And that was basically sort of where we were. I don't know what conversations Ananta and Maria had. I don't know how they thought about it, but they're both what you would call 100%ers. I mean, and 500%ers is like wherever they plant themselves, they just pour every ounce of their lifeblood into it, and that's that. I had to make very conscious decisions to never call Ananda Village home. And when we left, we took every single thing that we owned with us. We left nothing, because commitment is really essential. There has to be real commitment. Nothing great is ever created by dilettantes. It's created by people who, that this is who I am and this is my life, and we'll just start doing it. We always knew that we wanted community. If for no other reason, I'd lived 16 years in community. It was bad enough to have to move out of the country into the city, relatively speaking. But the idea of just living by myself was just unthinkable. I was so accustomed to being surrounded all the time by kindred spirits and being able to see my friends effortlessly, and far more importantly, to just be in an atmosphere where people were thinking about God. I was close enough to it at that time to remember when I moved. I had been living in San Francisco when I moved to Ananda Village. And after about 6 months, I'm talking now the summer of 71, and everything was totally primitive. I'd never camped in my life, and there I was living in a tent. It took me, I think, 24 hours to adjust, period. And after about 6 months, I had this very interesting realization, which is that I had always been psychically protecting myself. And all of a sudden I was in an atmosphere where I didn't have to. And the shift in my consciousness was startling, because it just so much energy that I'd been using, I didn't have to use anymore. Now I live in an more urban environment, and just we're 5 acres, and you step off the property and you're everywhere, But when I come home to an atmosphere. Just as soon as we walk on the property, the guard can come down, the psychic shield comes down. And when you live a great deal of time where you don't have a psychic shield up, you actually develop the capacity not to have to raise it. That's the only way I can put it. And if I was going to describe my experience of community, it's allowed me to feel that I can move through this world without having to protect myself all the time. And if you really think about that, that's really something. I remember we just rented, there was a group house, but for reasons that I actually have a pretty good idea of what Swami wanted, but he suggested we not live in the ashram, which was kind of odd, but that's what he suggested, really, because the ashram it would take too much of our time, and he knew that we could think in another way. He just wanted us outside of that atmosphere. But I remember in this rented house, looking out the window, and there was a man mowing the lawn, and he was the landlord's gardener. He was about 3 feet out my bedroom window. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his wife's name. I didn't know if he had children. I'd never been in his home. And I realized, oh my God, this is how everyone lives. This is how everyone lives. Is that you're surrounded by people that you don't know. And we just thought, we've got to get a community. So we thought, naive beings that we were, that everybody would want to live in community. Wouldn't it be fun? We'll all just live in community. So we started like this, we had, there were members. The first Sunday service we had when we arrived, we had this small one-room storefront, retail space sort of thing. But the first Sunday service, it was standing room only. So the first thing we had to do was to get a bigger one, which we hadn't really wanted to. We hadn't wanted to sort of, real estate does not interest us, but we had to move. So we just moved down the block. But we had 70 or 80 people at that first service. And that sort of became our core group. I think that was probably about the right number. That was when people were there. So it was a solid group. They were very loyal. Of course, Ananda and Bara were marvelous, and they built it up, and Jacqueline and Vasudeva. There were a lot of great souls there. And we just thought that here we are, we're just gonna have a community. Bingo, just like that. So we started having meetings and getting people together, and we discovered something extremely interesting. Everybody wanted us to start highly profitable businesses in which they could have good jobs with all their benefits, but still work with Ananda people. But about nobody wanted to move into community. Because in an urban environment, and I'm preaching to the choir here, so you know what I'm talking about, you need a haven. And as I began to watch, I began to realize that, because I was 24 when I moved to the community. I was never a grown-up anywhere. I mean, I played at being a grown-up for a couple of years, but I was never a grown-up because I was always a stranger in a strange land. So moving to Palo Alto, I had to find out how adults lived, because I really didn't know. And I found out that in an urban environment, and this is an appropriate thing to do, you have to get an environment where you can let your guard down. So whether people own their own homes, which of course some people do, or have an apartment, it was often a very tenuous process to get that place set up, whatever it might be. And to invite people to give up that reality and just move in altogether, it was so far down the list that we were absolutely stunned, and that continued to be an issue all the way through, and it was only actually solved much later. But so, however, we were fortunate because we had about 8 or 9 or maybe even 10 people who had all been sent there from the village. So they were experienced community living people, and they all knew that everything that everybody was afraid of wasn't true. And it was just, I don't know how else to say it, it just wasn't true. It was understandable why people were so nervous, but it wasn't true. I mean, some things are true. If you own your own home and you have to move into an apartment or whatever you end up doing, some of those things are true. But the essential reality of Ananda, and this is the other thing that I learned, and I learned it slowly because I didn't know. These were all, you have to bear in mind, all this was unknown. There was a powerful magnetism, there is a powerful magnetism that is Ananda. And I call it Master's Ray. For those of you who've been keeping in touch at all with the 9 a.m. broadcasts, I've been doing Swami's little pamphlet called A New Dispensation, and he talks about the power of this ray and the characteristics of it and how it's manifested in people, and Swami sees it everywhere. And he said that was true, but I didn't know if it would transfer. Was it actually in the soil or was it in the ether? And it was extremely interesting to me, and has been ever since, to realize that it's completely portable. And it goes with the devotees. And if the devotees are there, it'll work. And so the entire issue about community is, are we disciples of Master, and are we united in that teaching? And how much of Master do we carry with us? And I'll say that even differently. How sincere are we in our desire to live by Master's teachings? And if that sincerity is there, And if there is sufficient magnetism generated by leadership and by sincerity of people, then there's a kind of magnetic honesty. There's a kind of magnetism that keeps it in line. You know, all the questions that people ask, all the details, they sort of just sort themselves out if there is that fundamental integrity in individuals, because we're not held together by systems. We're held together by devotion to Master. So the the foundation for community is shared spiritual experience. Uh, when when people would ask me what the definition of the job of a colony leader is, I would always say to create wonderfully inspiring experiences for everyone. Because if we create wonderfully inspiring experiences, everything else will follow. And if we don't have wonderfully inspiring experiences, everything else is futile. Because there has to be some magnetic center that pulls people away from who they've been into who they want to be, and just makes it so much fun to be together, and that everything else becomes a smaller consideration. I remember, and you'll remember, Tina and Don Madison, Ramurti and Sita, you'll remember them. They owned a beautiful home not very far from where we set up our community. Very nice home. They'd lived in for a long time. They were savvy people about their money and their real estate and all that. And they weren't going to move because they lived half a mile from where we were all going to move and so on. But as the thing began to develop, and finally they just came in and they said, "It looks like so much fun. We don't want to be left out." And they just put their house on the market and just moved in. And it was entirely that. It was like, it was a FOMO, fear of missing out. But it was created because everybody in it really was, we were having such a good time because, oh my gosh, we were going to see each other every day. It was just going to be totally fun. Now
Madison's had 3 kids.
Pardon me? They had 3 kids. Yeah, they moved in with, actually they had 2 because the third one was born after they moved in. Right, but they had 2 children and, good jobs, both of them. He worked for some, I don't know, he was a Silicon Valley, he just worked, he was a serially monogamous. He worked for one startup after another, none of which I think ever made it, but he had lots of fun working for them. And finally, he got older and moved into Oracle, I think is where he is now. But in any case, they were, and he just, would just leave the community and go to his regular job, but he would come home to us. And it just really became us. Now, we had a few things, just practical things that I want to speak about. We realized that ashram houses are not suitable for everyone. That was one of the changes that we just realized. Ashram houses are difficult for most couples. Ashram houses are often difficult for couples with children. Not always. It depends on the children. I have to say, it's not really an ashram house, but in Hamilton, New Zealand, where Kavita Parshottam and her husband Arun and their 2 daughters, Divya and Vidya, they have this incredibly beautiful house with like 9 bedrooms or something. It was a fluke that they're not, the house makes them seem like they're very, very wealthy, but it was a weird thing where everybody in the area thought they were going to put a highway through the house. And so it was on for sale cheap. They weren't told. They bought it. Then the highway was never put through. So they end up with this huge, wonderful old house with like 10 bedrooms, I think. And Kavita just basically has run a retreat right out of her house. And her 2 daughters grew up that way. And they were teenagers probably. And they went to live with the grandmother for a while. And they came back home and they said, "Gosh, Grandma's house is just so dull. Every day it's just the same." She said, "Here, when you come down to breakfast, you never know who's going to be there." But to them, it was like, it made life so much more interesting than just living in, you know, a little box with just a few people. So it depends on the kids. But ashram life isn't for everyone, and it can be hard on marriages, depending on the marriages. And even many single people don't like sharing bathrooms, and you know, lots of things like that. So we felt ashram house had a limited expansion. It could expand only to a certain point, and with all due respect, you know, some of your best devotees were more established family people, or had property or things like that, and so apartments seemed like the best way to go. And I'm also speak from experience, and I've advocated this, but nobody listens to me. Nobody listens to me. But in any case, I think apartments, pretty much almost exactly like what we happen to have here, except with much better construction and design, are actually just about perfect, because you're really close to each other, but you can shut the door and have your own bathroom and kitchen and life. And if the soundproofing were a little better, you could have a little more privacy. We've soundproofed ours better. The gardens, the downstairs at least has a private garden, the upstairs has a balcony, fences around the garden or the balconies so that you can leave your blinds open. I mean, these are small things, but when you can leave your blinds open, when you're looking at a little bit of green, but when you go out your door, you'll naturally run into your neighbor. And so you're naturally running into people all the time, parking your cars in the same place. I mean, these things sound sort of silly, but after all these years, because then you constantly, spontaneously run into each other all the time. And a great deal of where community really happens is just like that. It's family, but a little bit more space, more privacy than shared kitchens and shared bathrooms. Now, I've lived in this big house for some period of time, and I've actually done group living in one house, which I never did before. And quite frankly, I always thought I wouldn't be able to enjoy it. I was pretty sure I would loathe it. And I've changed my mind. I've actually discovered it. I've lived months with different people, not years, but I've grown to love it too, because you get so close to people. You just make friendships like you wouldn't be able to make before. And then everything else that we worried about, all those big long lists of things that we're so worried about, they just like, they're not real values compared to spiritual family, guru by spiritual support. And then of course you add things like, you know, group meditation room, just all the obvious things. I'm talking about the less obvious things that, to my experience, have really made the texture of community. And just being able to help each other all the time and having them close to you. And, you know, there's always a few people that you like better than others. That's just the way life works. But we get to grow. You know, you can't protect yourself against everything. We have a long history with Ananda of knowing how to get along with each other. And if we can't immediately get along with each other, we can learn. I mean, your enemies also move into the community, sometimes next door. It just happens. There's one woman, because I'll use Swami's phrase, this is a very old spiritual family and we've been many things to each other. And this one woman came to me and she was so upset about the way this other man was behaving. I mean, she was beside herself, and she just went on and on. Finally, I said, I have an idea. Look, we have this big green area out here, which everybody in the apartments can come on their balconies. Let's invite everyone onto their balconies, out onto their porches, and let's take this man out to the center of the green and let's shoot him. Because if he's dead, he won't bother you anymore. And you know, she just looked at me like, have you lost your mind? And then I just said to her, what else are you going to do? Either, you know, like him or not, he's one of us. And, you know, what are you going to do about it? And I think she got better. I'm not 100% sure. So trust me, that also happens. I have relationships I've been working on for decades. and I'm gradually getting better at them. And, they're not, and then I have affinities that have been friendships for years. And then there are people that we have falling out, and, you don't talk to each other for 6 or 7 years, and then you forget that you're mad at each other, and then all of a sudden you're friends again. But you can't do that. You can't do that if you can get away from each other. Then you get to run away all the time. So it's everything. I'm going to actually now just let you ask me questions. Oh, and last thing. We didn't want to build because we didn't want to deal with county regulations. We were not interested in the process of making a community. Now, other people feel differently. Other people have, I'm just speaking very personally. Some people have architectural ideas. They have sociological ideas. They have lots of ideas that they want to express. And they need a blank palette to build the whole thing up. And so they want to build it in a certain way. My orientation has always been people. My concept of my life is a mouth and a microphone. That's who I am. I don't, everything else. And it's all about the people. Community is about people. You can basically live anywhere in any circumstances with the right people. The Mahabharata, where Yudhishthira was more willing to go to hell with his brothers than to be in heaven with the Kauravas. He just wasn't going to do it. That was that, because it's the people. And that sounds so obvious. The community is the people, but read my lips. The community is the people. And it isn't true that if you build it, they will come, because they won't. They'll stay in their own houses, believe me. You have to want to be together, or there has to be enough of you who really want to be together that everyone else will join you because they're afraid of missing out. Okay? And then it has to be adequate. I think your living circumstances have to be adequate. Otherwise, you're asking too much of people. But I like the fact that our community was a little crummy. It was just a little crummy. Well, that's not true. It was really crummy. It was super crummy. I'm such an old renunciate that to me, it's like, I live in, some of you have seen the house I live in now. It embarrasses me is not quite the right word to live in this house. I've grown accustomed. I understand the karma of it. I accept it happily. It's wasted on me. Let's just put it like that. I enjoy it. I've been here now for 12 years. It's perfectly fine. It's the right place. But a little funky is my ideal. That's not everybody's, I agree. But the fact that it was a little funky, I actually liked that, because I didn't want people to move in because it was a much nicer place to live than where they were living. It was better that they were moving into a place that was a little worse than where they had been living, because then they would come for the right reasons. Because if people are just coming, with all due respect, to set up their own little fort again, this is why, even though there's a lot of reasons why individual houses are nice and a lot of space around your house are nice, there's a lot of good reasons, but my home, my castle, my fort, I can still set up my atmosphere. Ananda Village is a great place. I haven't lived there in 30 years, so I have no idea what it's like now, really at all. But I like apartments. I really think that it's closer, but the end point was, we didn't want to build. We didn't want to have to deal with zoning. We didn't want to deal with counties. It would be a years and years project. We were not interested in that. We wanted to live with people we loved, and we wanted to do it soon. And we knew that people would get much deeper on the path if they could have satsang with each other in a spontaneous way. That's just the way, that's the truth. It's a simple truth of it. And so apartments were ready-made communities, and all they needed was what they needed. Now, we actually, and some of you may know about this, we didn't have money. It was very early in our process. So it was purchased privately for the purpose of making a community, which was a fantastically wonderful idea, because we've had a wonderful community for 30 years. We got exactly what we wanted. We got the opportunity to live together without any huge hassle. There is an inherent conflict between having a community and having it be owned as a profit-making enterprise. And it's taken a number of years for those two values to begin to collide. They've begun to collide in our world, and the end of that story is not yet known. But we've had a magnificent 30 years, and God willing, we will continue indefinitely into the future. And there's a lot of reasons why that's likely to happen. It's just that unresolved confusions about that structure and misunderstandings that grew up over time, and runaway inflation of land values, lots of things happened. But nonetheless, we've accomplished exactly what we wanted to accomplish, which was we've had 30 years of magnificent community. And if, which I pray to God it doesn't happen, this location becomes unviable, we'll just take the community and put it somewhere else, because the community exists. During the Bertolucci lawsuit, when I thought Ananda might be reduced to nothing, well, we might lose everything physically, which we didn't. We didn't know. It was a big, hairy thing because we were being sued for millions of dollars. But I always had this funny picture in my mind of all of us, and it was a completely unrealistic picture. It was like a movie scene where all of us would come out of our apartments and we'd all be carrying suitcases, and we wouldn't be having rolling suitcases like people have, but we'd have like 1930s leather valises. I don't know why that was why I thought it, but we'd all be standing there like the 1930s, standing there on the sidewalk, like all 80 or 100 of us just standing out on the sidewalk in the front of Monroe Drive. And we would just sort of be standing there holding our suitcases, a little stunned, while the plaintiff came in and took over our homes. And then somebody would crack a joke, everyone would laugh, and we'd just walk down the road together and figure out what we were going to do next. And when I really got that picture in my head, and I've had to run that same scenario because we've been threatened again, or God has been teasing us. And at first I was very scared about it, but now we have a community. And if it has to be somewhere else, now do not ever for a moment underestimate the amount of effort it requires to create something on this planet. I think it's easier, the next iteration, the next iteration, the next iteration. It's not like you have to pull it out of the ether. It's right in front of you. Your options are right in front of you. You have people who already have done it. You don't have to invent the wheel. You don't have to ask 1,000 questions. We have a fantastic way of running communities that absolutely works. Just do it again. It's not even slightly mysterious. It's perfectly self-evident. And we have a little bit of experience that we can help you not make catastrophic errors. You don't have to make every mistake that we've made. And times are different. You may have a new idea. But it takes a tremendous amount of effort. And there have to be people for whom there have to be at least a core group of people who there's two things for it. They're going to do everything they can to make it work, and they know it's going to work. That's basically it. They just know it's going to work. We always knew it was going to work. And that was just there. When we asked Swami, actually, how should we pray for the community? Now remember, he said, don't bother to ask God if it's a good idea. Self-evidently, it's a good idea. You don't have to keep wondering if it's a good idea. Of course, he wants you to have a community. Just ask him how to do it and to give you the clarity and the strength to do it. And he does, he will. There's much more financial sophistication within Ananda, within our experience, than there was in the past. So there's all kinds of options are available. None of that, I know nothing about any of that. Money is not my story. It's never been my story, but there's a lot of people who do. So, we don't have to flail about. People can figure that out. But there has to be this deep, heartfelt commitment to it. If you're just casual, it won't happen. So, any thoughts, comments, questions, protestations of innocence, whatever you like?
I was I was going to comment on what you talked about a little earlier about the psychic shield, and having it, having to drop it. You know, I lived. For those of you who know what Ananda Laurelwood was, it was pretty much more of an ashram setting where we all lived together, and I lived there for years and years. And I would agree with you that when I moved here to the Portland community, like three and a half years ago, that having your own like little apartment there, like you were talking about, is you can go in, you can shut the door, you can have your own kitchen. I mean, don't get me wrong. Living at Laurelwood all the years I did was an extremely transformational time in my life. One that probably, and there was a lot of things that were very enjoyable. Like we doing everything together. I mean, granted, there was people that came there and they didn't stay that long because maybe it was too much togetherness for them. And but I noticed, there was times when I was living at Laurelwood where I sometimes would not leave the property. The property itself, Laurelwood itself, is 55 acres, and then we had the surrounding 175 acres that we built some houses on. But there was times that I did not leave Laurelwood, sometimes for months at a time, did not sell off the property. And when I did, I would usually go with somebody into town, maybe for whatever reason, and the dramatic shock of going into the world, so to speak, was.
But Chris, before you go too far with this, I really want to say something that's very, very important. There's two kinds of spiritual life. There's the ashram life and there's the missionary life. And people are drawn to different ones and to different periods of their life. And I'm a missionary. I'm not an ashramite. A missionary meaning I want to go where the heathen are. I want to live with the heathen, and I want to help the heathen to find God. When Swamiji in the 80s, early 80s, when he stopped wearing his orange robes, when he went out to speak, he for a while even shaved off his beard, he cut off his long hair. He started wearing a coat and a tie instead of his orange robes. And he said, if you want to convert the heathen, you got to look more like the heathen. That's how he put it. Meaning you have to make people feel that you're part of them. So, I lived 16 years in a very isolated way, but that was not my life. And even the last 5 years of those 16 years, my job was traveling and then working at the retreat. So what my novitiate, which is actually the word I got recently, was isolated. But once I got myself established, my destiny is a missionary. And it's a tricky business. Some people want ashram because they have a deep inner life and that's the right life for them. I remember Sadhana Devi writing to Swamiji Jaya's wife when Swami was pushing during this very period of time, the early 80s, when he was really pushing Ananda outward. She wrote and she said, I'm happy you're doing it, but I'm not interested. Her name is Sadhana Devi. She just wants to be home. She was raising a child. She said, this is, my life. And Swami said, thank God. He said, I'll go out and tell everyone about community, but somebody has to stay home and make it, make a community. So you develop differently. And it's important to realize that both have a lot of validity. Our urban community is the perfect balance between it. We're not quite as cityfied. We're not Los Angeles, we're suburban, more like this. Suburban is a nice compromise between ashram and missionary, because suburban, you have easy access to the heathen, you have easy access to building your temple, but you have ashram atmosphere. And then what happens is the psychic shield. Basically, you get strong enough on the spiritual path that you can keep your magnetism no matter where you are. But it's just one of those like super positive benefits is you really go home. I mean, many of you have visited here, and some of you, I see your faces, you live here. It's like you step across the property line and you're somewhere else. I mean, you don't, it's unreasonable. It's unreasonably stronger than it should be, except that it is, because Master is in the ether, he's not in the soil. And so, all of you who are thinking about community, and all of you who are in the spot that all our people were here when we arrived and started off, telling them we were going to get a community and expected them to be happy. I'll tell you, there is, quote, a famous meeting that we had about this. When we were getting closer to getting a community, we had a big community forum, and we all sat around in a big circle. Were you there, Ramurti and Sita? Were you at that meeting? Do you remember? Might have been before. But anyway, there was about maybe 50 people. That would be a large number. It might not have been that many. We were going to have a whole day retreat. We were going to envision our community. We were going to make, everybody was going to talk about it. So we're going around the room and everybody's talking. And most of the people, the first people who talked were mostly people who had lived at Ananda Village and knew that it was a great place and everybody's fears were just not valid. And then one person started worrying about this and worrying about that. And what if this happens and what if that happens? And, all the positive magnetism in the room was just diminished a little. Then the second person said, well, what if this happens and what if that happens? And, you could feel the air in the room going down. And then the third person, who's, he said, well, what if this and what if this? And I'm watching the whole thing die right in front of my eyes. It's just being eaten alive by three negative people. I don't want to call them negative. The third one was really a negative person. The other two were just nervous people who were just telling us about all their fears, thinking it would help. And when the third person started talking, I said, oh my God, it's lunchtime. And I just cut him off. He never forgave me. He's no longer with us. I just cut him off because I couldn't let him kill it, because I knew everything he was saying was just his imagination. And all three of them, because I knew it was all just imaginary. And then when we came back, we never had open mic after that. We just didn't, because it wasn't going to help. We knew where we were going. We knew what we were doing. We knew it would work. And you can't just persuade everyone until you can show it to them. And then it'll happen in the right way. And it's depending on where you all end up. There's a wonder. It's wonderful to have country. We now have a farm, although for various reasons only a handful of people live there. Barely a handful live there. Just a few. Most of us live right where we are. We're very integrated into the urban setting, which was simpler in certain ways. Now with everything, with the internet and all of that, I really don't know where you need to be or what you can do. But anyway, those two realities exist and have to be thought about. Ideally is to have both, which you did in Portland for a long time, but not at the moment.
Yeah, go ahead. Was someone going to say something?
I was just wondering if anyone else had a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question that I think has some relation to the question of sort of missionary versus ashramite. In Australia, so we don't have a large pool of Ananda devotees to connect with as far as we know. And so I wonder about, I've certainly registered this fact that you need to have this core group to begin. But what then do you set as the minimum sort of standard for people to become a part of a community or to become a part of an initial ashram house? Is it do you set as the condition that they need to have taken discipleship? Do you just accept anyone who's got a sincere aspiration?
Patrick, you're probably not asking the right person that question. Because I'll explain this to you. It's very hard to evaluate people, and it's very hard to set objective standards. I mean, I put a comment into Light Bearer, the book about Swami, because it was very helpful to me. Several different things. At one point he said, don't tell people what the standards for membership are. He said, just watch them and see what they do naturally. If you tell them what the standards for membership are, they'll just meet them. They'll just do what you've told them to do. And you won't actually really know who you're dealing with. He said in another place, the reason I say I'm not the right person is, well, let me say the other part. Swami said in another place, there's certain people thrive on just making decisions intuitively in the moment. And other people need to have things a little bit more clear cut. So I've always resisted writing anything down. I've always resisted, telling people what they're supposed to do and so on like that. None of that has ever worked for me because it's never worked for me. So I've never been any good at imposing things on people. The way Ananda has always worked is we create a clear magnetism. We know who we are and we know what we're doing. In our temple, in everything that we've done, in our school, in the community, we know who we are and we know what we're doing. And if you're in tune with it, you'll want to be there. And so it's not like you have to ask people how, you don't have to figure out whether they're in tune or not, because there's an it. And if they're in tune with the it, they'll be there. And if they're not in tune with it, they won't want to be there. Now, but practically speaking, when we set up this community, we made a very specific decision, which we've still followed, which is the leases are month to month. Because we wanted in our urban community, we wanted a very low entry bar and a very easy exit door. Because we didn't want people to get stuck when they got out of tune. We wanted them to be able to walk away. But in as much as the experiment we were doing was somewhat radical for people who hadn't grown up in it as I had, and so we wanted it to make it easy for them to come and try it out and then let them discover from their own experience that they loved it. Whereas if we'd given them, 6 pages of things they had to agree to before they walked in, no drugs, no drinking, no barbecue on your patio, no loud televisions because our insulation is so terrible, just lots of things like that. But it was just the opposite of setting it all up. But there was an it there, there was a Sangha, there was a community of people, there was an understanding of devotees. So that's how it worked. Now, I just think there's one more point on that. But you have to use your common sense. There are people that we just don't belong, and people will come in for the wrong reasons. Usually we've managed to finesse it. There's been a few people who wanted to come in who were really not suitable, and we've kind of had to work around it. But the other thing about apartments is, and this would also be true for individual houses as opposed to a group house, which is people can just come and go. So there's about 80 of us are Ananda, but there's 20 or 25 here who aren't even part of Ananda. They're just people who wanted to be in an atmosphere like this, but they just come and go. People come and go. They don't interfere with our lives at all. We don't have, but now you're talking to me. If you talk to other people, you'll get very different answers. We've never had mandatory anything because I've been part of group living for 50 years, practically now. And I've never seen anyone come to group meditation who didn't want to come to group meditation. I've sat in on countless meetings about how if it was just at 7:05 instead of 7 o'clock, then more people would come. If it ended at 6:49 instead of 6:52, then more people would come. If there was 2 chants instead of 1, and I honestly, I'm telling you the truth, I've never seen a single change in attendance ever by any of those conversations. People will come if it inspires them, and they won't if they won't. But one of the things you need to do is you need to give people enough choices that everybody will have a source of inspiration within your family. And then if everybody has a source of inspiration, then everybody is inspired and everybody starts moving upward. but it isn't the same source for everyone, which is, I mean, but you're talking to me, and I'm not even in charge here anymore. And the people who are in charge are different than I am. I'm much more comfortable with no form. I'm more comfortable with no form than most people are, because that's just the way I am. So these things are also very individual, and they cannot be decided in the abstract. You will just talk forever, and you'll make all sorts of lists. You have to start with people. You start with people, and then you have the people, they are who they are, and your community is created out of who they are. You don't create your community first and then try to find people who fit. You have your family and you create your community out of who's there. I mean, when Swami first started, it was even much wilder, because you had to have somebody. He was starting a community. He was the only one who had the foggiest idea what was going on. Jyotish, of course, arrived very early and shared the vision. Devi came very soon, Jaya, Binay, Haridas, a few others. I came about a year and a half later, 2 years later. There are others. I'm number 13, so there's a bunch of others. He was the only one who had any idea, but it was the late 60s, and there were roaming bands of back to the landers, utopia people all over the place. Famously, we had what we called, this bus came in, this bus of hippies that said, "Yay God" on the outside, and they parked down by the market area for a long time. The Yay God people, we always called them for years. We would refer to, oh yeah, you remember when the Yay God people were here? and so there was a lot of goofy people around. I mean, all good people, but goofy people. There were naked people who would just sort of wander around naked, and it was just, there we were. That was just what we were doing. And many of them became wonderful devotees. But it just came out of who they were. And Swami's way of doing it always was, people are everything, and you do what's good for the people that you have. They get stronger and stronger, and then their magnetism attracts more. People are the best part of community and the worst part of community. When Gary McSweeney was in charge, I don't remember what was going on, but it was something. And he and I, and actually it was he just humored me. I made up this system where all the people would just stay in their apartments until we needed them. I mean, we were just joking, but I was just letting off steam. That we would put them in their apartments, and we would close the gates on their apartments, and they would all just stay there until we needed to show people that we had a community, and then we would let them out, and then they could come into the courtyard and sort of show that we had a community, and then we would put them all back in. Gary pointed that out to me, that's called prison. That's what that's called. It was just a joke, but it was, it's like, you get involved with people, you're involved with people. And there are days, I'm never seriously, deeply, but a little humor helped me. Gary also tells me, or maybe it was you, Chidambar, I'm not sure, that at one point I was behind a bush throwing rocks at one of them, and I'm not really quite sure why. Both of them were the managers, and the details are obscure to me, but the fact that I was behind a bush throwing rocks at them remains. We've all stayed friends. But that's what you're working with. And it's wonderful. It's just absolutely wonderful.
You mentioned having a variety of sources of inspiration so people could find the ones that they were in tune with. What are examples of the different kinds? What do you mean? Well,
we always had lots of kirtan. I mean, and I'm going to talk about when I was more involved in that side of it. In 2012, Swamiji basically told me to step away from being too responsible for this community and to define myself in a global sense. So I am emeritus, is what I've called myself. If you're emeritus, you still get to use the library, and you get to teach graduate seminars, and you can have an office in the main building. So that's basically where I live now, but I don't have actual responsibility. But this is the way I would think about it. You have appropriate satsang, You have to think always in terms of everybody needs an appropriate satsang group. The people who are just coming for the first time and are not disciples need a conversation that's related to that. But people who have been Kriyabans, and especially if you're thinking longevity, I've been in one place for more than 30 years, and many of the people who are part of this have been here for more than 30 years with us. Chidambar preceded us, Ramurti and Sita were on site before we arrived. And when you're introducing people to the path and they're not yet disciples, you have to have one kind of conversation. But when people are already disciples, when they're new disciples, you have a different kind of conversation. When they're longtime Kriyabans, you have a different kind of conversation. Everybody needs appropriate satsang. So my way, whenever I would look at the program, and I speak with a personal pronoun I, because for many years, David and I were doing it, and my responsibility was the program. He and I worked on it together, of course, all the time, always. We were of one mind on it, but I would always look at what our offerings were, and I would think about the people there, and I would think, do we have appropriate satsang for every level of involvement? And I think that's been one of the things that's made this community strong, is that people could associate and have open conversation about the issues that were their real issues. And so that worked, appropriate satsang. Then you need, and then this is the most complicated one. And it's in the New Dispensation brochure that I've been reading for the last 10 or 12, 9 a.m. mornings. I'm not quite finished. Even long hours of meditation without a corresponding effort to get in tune will not bring you what you're looking for spiritually. So the actual role of meditation on our path is more subtle than you would think it is. For one, and I just say this frankly, most people do not meditate very well. And most people are not capable of getting all their inspiration just from meditation. And the people who do don't need much help from you. So it really doesn't matter. But some of those who can get really deep inspiration from meditation need satsang, and they need attunement, depending on who they are. Everybody needs to meditate, and Kriya is really important. But if you define, I'll just speak for myself, if you define your community too much by getting Kriya and then meditating at a certain whatever you lay it out, you lose a lot of really good devotees. Because this is a very, 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 very restless age. And when people have jobs and have families, they need to meditate. But meditation is a means to an end. And meditation is the means, and the end is to be attuned to God and to love God and to be able to choose happiness and to feel joy and to see God in everyone and to want to give your heart to everyone. And so if you end up making what you're doing about meditation, then the people who don't meditate that well, which are usually more people than will want to admit it to you, always feel guilty and always feel like second-class citizens. But so you have to just make sure, again, it's appropriate. You have to make sure there's appropriate. You have to have lots of opportunities for people to serve, lots of kirtan. Kirtan is wonderful. And of course, you have Kriya, you have meditation. I remember, we've all tried this, and I don't know how it's working for you guys, but I'll tell you how it worked for us. We need more longer meditations. We started this long meditation, and we did it week after week, solidly week after week, until I was practically the only one there, or whoever happened to be leading it was the only one who came. And I had to think, there's something wrong with this picture. Even though everybody should want to come and we should have this, nobody is coming. And so I had to stop and think, well, who am I serving? Like, what am I trying to accomplish here? And it's not like you don't keep it there, but you have to be careful so that people can grow into things and be themselves. It's just the way it is. Swami says in his brochure he would never speak against meditation, but he has observed. So, there was one woman particularly who spoke to me. I remember she just basically said she can't meditate. She's just a lousy meditator. She is. But she loves Ananda, and she loves the vibration, and she loves the music, and she loves to serve, and she loves liturgy, and she loves ceremony. And you know, I love ceremony. I love events. I love liturgical dance, you know, I like theater. So, you know, I put a lot of that stuff in and everybody has fun. But the end of it is that they get deeply inspired and they come back. And that's basically, you know, sort of what makes it work. We're all different. Master said we have to do 1% of what he taught, but everybody takes a different 1%. So again, that's why you have to build it on your people. If you have a group of people who are all really deep meditators, you can build a community on deep meditation. And you know, the monks in India have a very, very, very strong meditation schedule, and they all conform to it. And different Ananda communities, the Sacramento community grew up more around meditation than many other communities because that was Ananta and Maria. And I believe that Dharmadas and Nirmala are also going that way. The Palo Alto community did not grow up as much around long meditation or group meditation. It's probably because I was an influence and I was always thinking in lots of other ways. You know, that's just how it is. The other thing, you know, when there was a point when we were starting our community, and this is also important, that there was a real question from Ananda Village about whether or not we should do this. And we had a meeting up there with Swamiji and others, and their concern was that we were going to want money and personnel from Ananda Village, which was never in our mind. It had never crossed our mind to do that. And we said, guys, the problem is that our Sangha needs something really big to do. You know, they need to pick up some impossible project and succeed at it. And it would be exactly the wrong thing to import people who would make it happen for them. They need to make something happen for themselves. And if we don't start this community, we're going to have to find something else of equal magnitude, because this is how devotees build their muscle. So the other question about what's appropriate is, and it's been the hardest thing, and I feel that I haven't really succeeded in doing it. The hardest thing has been to provide sufficient dynamic opportunities for people to serve. And Swamiji was, you know, he would just create department after department and project after project, and he was able to manifest the money to just make these things happen. And he was just doing it, well, actually in the 80s when he was really pushing everything big. And then he stopped pushing it globally. He's at a certain point, he paused and he said, my goal was to make Ananda broad enough that every devotee would have a meaningful way to serve. He said, I'm not trying to build an empire. I just want every devotee to have a meaningful way to serve. And he says, I feel like I've done enough in that direction. And then he pulled back from that a little bit. But it's a catch-22. You have to have enough going so that there's enough for people to do, and you have to have enough people so that you can get enough going. And you guys are sort of caught a little bit on the cusp right now. It's a tricky business. But if Master wants it, see, this is where we have to go. This is where we were in 1986. If this is really a worldwide movement, if this is really the social pattern of the future, if this is really what Master really wanted us to do, then it will work. And that's what I mean about, there have to be a few people. And I don't just mean that it's wishful thinking. There's an intuitive knowingness. And I don't take on a project unless I have that feeling about it. Because it's been honed in me. I mean, I learned that the hard way. But if there's a certain feeling, and I know that if we just persevere, we'll succeed. And there have to be at least a few people who people who are practical. You have to have visionaries who are practical, being practical in your idealism. And a few of those can carry everyone else. And if this is Master's dream for the future, we just have to put our force into it. And even if, things don't last forever. Laurelwood at this point doesn't look like it has a future. Ocean Song was a fantastic, wonderful project, 7 years, and then it couldn't go further. We've been, in a confusion about what's happening here. The confusion seems to have calmed somewhat, but there's still a lot of uncertainties. Once you work as hard as we've worked to create a form, you don't want to give it up easily. Giving up Ocean Song, giving up Laurelwood, these are horrible developments. I don't want to just be light about these things. But not everything works externally. But if everybody tries really hard and learns a lot, you lay it down to succeed the next time. Either the same people or the next generation. So no effort is ever lost.
Well, what about fun?
What about fun?
Yeah.
What do you mean? Like, what is fun? Well, one of the longest lasting
and community, fun and community.
One of the longest lasting ministries in our community was the volleyball ministry. I don't know if the volleyball ministry is still operating or not, because I think a number of them aged out of it. I think some of the key volleyball players aged out of the volleyball, and does anyone know if the Chittenbar, is the volleyball ministry still active, or is it gone?
It's mostly gone at this point.
But it went on for 25 years or so. And I think they never missed, they played every Sunday afternoon outside, and they never went a whole month in 25 years or so without playing at least once on Sunday. And it was really a really big part of life. It was just like, you could never, there would be this strange sort of energy whenever you try to schedule anything on Sunday afternoons. There would be just a few people in the room who would get this kind of hunted look in their eyes when you'd start trying to schedule any kind of a meeting or anything like that. And then you'd remember that it was the volleyball ministry and you just couldn't interfere with it. You absolutely couldn't. All the key people in the community, it was mostly men. There were just a couple of women who would play, but it wasn't gender specific. It's just there were just a few women who felt to play, but it was all the men, and they'd really look. It was just a very important part of our life. The fun is inherent. The fun is inherent because we're fun, and you just run into each other, and you tell funny stories, and you tell jokes, and you laugh about everything. It's just right there. But Ramurti is also talking about the fact that what has made Ananda possible, and this was Swami's answer, and I think it was I who asked the question, but who knows now after all these years. What is Ananda's mission? And Swami's answer was to have fun. And then we all laughed, because that seemed like such a dopey answer. I expected, we really expected something much more serious than that. So this was somewhere time in the 70s. I asked him that, or it was asked. He said to have fun, and then we all laughed, and then we stopped laughing, and he said, but I have to explain what I mean by fun. He said, fun for us is to feel Divine Mother's presence in our lives and to share her with everyone we meet. But he actually also meant that we had to have fun. And sometimes let me put it this way. Swamiji said something once about Master. He said, I could never put this in the path because he said, I just didn't know how to work with it. And he even said he might have put it in the biography, but I'm not sure, his biography of Master. But he said to me, I don't know how to exactly put this, but Master was just adorable. That's what he said. He even said, Master was so cute. He said, I know, he said, that sounds crazy. You're talking about your God-realized guru. But what he meant was he was just so lighthearted and so magnetic. And he just opened your heart. You just wanted to be where he was. And Swami, sometimes when people would ask me about Swami, I would just say he was just so much fun. It was just so much fun to be with him. He always had something interesting to say. He often had something witty to say. He was extremely appreciative of good humor. he could always see the ludicrous side of things, even when things were serious and heavy. I mean, I've often told the story of when he walked out of his morning of testifying in the Bertolucci lawsuit, which was just a nightmare on a scale that's really hard to describe. And most of us were excluded from the courtroom, and he'd been in there with what the attorney that we lovingly called the Velociraptor. He was just so horrible. And Swami was just so like, it was awful. And we all had to wait in the hall, and we just, it was a nightmare. And I have to go back, which most of you know, but James Bond movies then were much more innocent, much less gratuitous violence. And Swami always enjoyed them because they were just tongue-in-cheek ridiculous. And one of the things about James Bond is that he was extremely particular about his martinis. And I mean, I've never been a drinker at all, so I don't understand this, but you can either stir them or you can put them in the shaker. And he always, James Bond always wanted his martinis shaken. It was extremely important. So Swami comes out of the courtroom, and the Velociraptor and all his cohorts come out after him. And, they've just done their worst to Swami. And we're just, like, we can hardly stand it. There's like 20 or 30 of us, and we crowd around Swami, as if to protect him from the evil demons who are just feet away from us. And somebody, it was a woman, some woman said, "Oh, sir, how are you?" He said, let's see. Oh, excuse me. James Bond liked it stirred, not the opposite. So Swami looks at us and he said, "Stirred, but not shaken." Just like that. And we all knew he was talking about James Bond's preference for a martini. And it was about the most ridiculous thing we'd ever heard. All of us just burst out laughing. And Swami, I can still see him standing there in the courtroom hallway. We were all just laughing. And the poor Velociraptor, he just didn't know what to do with it. And then Swami said, "Let's go have lunch." And we just walked out. You'll sell your house, you'll change the school for your children, you'll live in one room and share a bathroom, if you can be in an atmosphere like that, right? Where it's just like, whatever happens, the joy comes back. That's what we're all trying to accomplish with our little homes and our, IRAs and all this. And I'm not making light of any of that. Believe me, I'm a grown-up now. I get it. When I was a kid, I didn't get any of this. When I was a spiritual kid, I recognize it. But what we're really trying to get with that is to be able to be stirred but not shaken, right? That's what we're really looking for. And we have so much power together. I've lived with it for so long now. It's so cellular with me. But it's just, we have so much power together, and we build that power by having the nerve to risk a little bit and put our energy together. Yeah, it takes courage and it takes risk, and we have to invest ourselves in it. But the rewards this is Master's work. This is what he wants us to do. Quite apart from whether the world is going to fall apart and all of our little plans are going to go to nothing anyway. There was a novel, I don't know if Sita Ramurti, you remember this. It was called, I believe it was called Lucifer's Hammer. Do either of you remember Lucifer's Hammer? And we should look it up. It was an end of the world book. And since Swami's been telling us the end of the world was coming since the 70s, and it was a good novel, as I recall. It was a readable novel. And it was about a meteor that was going to come and hit Earth. So everybody on Earth knew it was coming, and they basically knew that Lucifer's hammer was going to strike the Earth at this point, and then this big thing would happen. And it was actually a really fun novel because everybody made different plans about how to deal with the end of the world, including my favorite, of course, was the surfer who was going to paddle out and ride the last tsunami in. And then, and people made every possible kind of preparation. But what was so interesting in the story was that very few people's plans, except maybe the surfers, actually were executed in the way they expected because karma took over. And the most prepared ended up the least well off, and the least prepared, but the the most generous hearted. I mean, it was a nice book because it worked that way. Good people got good things rather than those awful books where it's the other way. But we have to really ask ourselves, what is this life for? What am I doing? How am I going to accomplish it? What do I really want? And what form will give it to me? And is that easy? No, it's not. But if we can cross the line, or if we can ride the wave that somebody else is creating and be a good worker bee behind whoever is the one who has the power for it, I'm just amazed what Ananda can do. I mean, back there in the 70s, I remember walking around with Jyotish. This was before the movie Truman, which was such an obvious, where he's like really in this false bubble. I used to joke about the fact that we were a gigantic experiment. We were all actually in some kind of a lunatic asylum, and they had just turned it over to the inmates. And that there was some kind of an electrified fence just a little farther out from where we were, because nothing we did was actually possible. But it was all possible. And it still is.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just to touch on, like stories like Swami with the lawsuit, and you just said, well, it won't be easy and things like that. So actually just coming back to a story that Ramurti just told on Sunday service about this Swami or somebody who came to Ananda village, and he was amazed, and he said, wow, somebody must have put a ton of tapasya to make this happen. And Swami said, yes, it was me. Can you talk about that part, the tapasya?
That was, let's see, was it Keshav Das who said that? It wasn't Chidananda, it was Keshav Das. Keshav Das? Or do you remember? Doesn't matter. But we just to get the tone right on that, Aaron, because it was sweeter the way Swami did it. That we'd shown the man around, and then he said very, very seriously, this, I think it was Swami Sant Keshav Das, but it might
That's
have
right.
been Swami Sant Keshav Das. He said, my, like this, my, because Sant Keshav Das was himself a notable spiritual leader who was also working to build a work and so on. He said, my, somebody did a lot of tapasya to make this possible. And Swami just very quietly said, yes, me. Like that. Yes, me. And when Swami was in India, he went to India in 2003 and immediately started having immense physical problems. They went in and out of they went to the small hospital near the ashram. They went in and out of it so much they checked in and out like it was their favorite hotel. Same room as always, they would say to the nurse. The nurse would say, yeah, I'll just go down to whatever it was. And Swami's, he was having heart problems. His body was swelling. He was having what they call congestive heart failure, which is, pretty serious if it goes to the end. He's in the hospital bed, sitting there recovering for the 10th time in several months. And a Himalayan Swami comes in to see him. I have no idea who the man was. I happened to be there, even though I didn't live in India. And the Swami comes in. He says, oh, sir, I'm so sorry to see you unwell. Swami says, oh, just doing tapasya for the work in India. Don't worry about me. Now, I asked Swami about that afterwards. I said, what is this? What are you talking about? And he said, well, in every great epic, when the hero has something immense to do, he always goes off and does penance before he does it, doesn't he? He goes off and he gathers his forces so that he can have the power to do it. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is, and this is just subtle, and there's no possible way I can understand this, I just know it's true. Energy has to come from somewhere. And if a person has a lot of magnetism, like Swami did, he can basically draw a tremendous amount of force into himself, and somehow by, it's like, another way of putting it is, there's a certain number of obstacles that have to be overcome. And those obstacles could manifest, and lots of people could be working on them, or a person of great magnetism can draw them into himself and use his body if he chooses, and basically work out all those obstacles through his body. That's what Master did. at the end of his life. You're working out the obstacles by taking on the karma of the disciples, and then you're purifying and uplifting them so they have more strength to do it, because he's taken our karma. You're taking the karma of the situation on yourself and working it out through his own body so that those obstacles will not present themselves. Now, that's one level of tapasya, and it's very interesting. That's taking the karma that's not your own. And I want to say this very strongly. Master tells us in his healing techniques that if your hand is cut off by your willpower, you can remanifest your hand. Now that's a pretty high level of teaching, and most of us probably can't consider it, but Master presents it as if it were an option. But about taking karma that isn't your own, Master says, advanced yogis can do this by a subtle technique. In other words, he does not recommend it. He does not tell us that we can do it. So don't think, oh, I'm just going to take the karma, because he doesn't ever speak of it. So when I speak of tapasya, what I mean is that it takes a lot of energy, and somebody has to be willing to put out that energy. If you want to be an Olympic champion, you have to give up a whole lot of other things in order to have the time and the energy to do this. You can't just do everything that you want to do and expect to have any real energy for the thing that you're trying to do. One Olympic gold medalist described his workout program, and it was hours and hours and hours. He said, this is what I do every day. Christmas, wedding anniversary, my children's birthday. This is what I do. That's tapasya. But he wasn't suffering. He was enjoying himself immensely because it was a goal he wanted to reach. And that's how Swami was about it. I did a lot of tapasya. That's why I said to that Swami, he just laughed. He's lying there with congestive heart failure. He just laughs. Oh, don't worry. I'm just doing tapasya for the work in India. I'm delighted to be doing this. And so that's how, those first years at Ananda Village, which I absolutely loved, those first 10 years were like heaven on earth. I lived in this trailer with the grass growing through the floor. And I had a little bucket bath. Never crossed my mind that it was anything but wonderful. It was just absolutely wonderful. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. But on a certain level, it was enormous tapasya. So there's one definition of tapasya is devotion. And we were watching a movie, and it was the subtitle. The character says tapasya, the subtitle says devotion. We all burst out laughing. We thought that was such a joke. The great fear at Ananda when you ask Swami for a name is that he might call you Tapasyananda or something like that. But later on, Swami said, no, of course, that's a perfect definition for it. Is that I'm devoted to this. So other people look at me like I'm renouncing something. I'm not renouncing anything. I'm going for a goal that's worthwhile. I'm going to have a life that really matters. It's worth it to me. I'm going to serve my guru. I'm going to make something happen, or I'm going to die trying, which is fine. You can also die trying. You don't have to succeed. It's nice to succeed, and it's good to try to succeed, but you can succeed and still fail if you do it correctly. And yes, where is the energy going to come from? Just where is the energy going to come from? Has to come from somewhere. Somebody has to channel it. Who's going to do it? And there's this many people who want to. I'm counting all of us. But we're just this tiny, we're one pat of butter spread over the whole globe is how I think of us right now. We're just tiny. But we have the masters behind us, so what we accomplish is totally out of proportion to who we are, just absurdly out of proportion.
Thank you, Asha.
Thank you all very much. It's a great joy to be with you. God bless.